So as the war between the US, Israel, and Iran continues to intensify, there's something that isn't being discussed enough. That's not just when the war will end, but how. What will decide its end point? When wars are discussed on TV or online, perhaps here on YouTube, the focus is usually on territory, leadership, battlefield victories, be them on the ground or in the air. But sometimes the outcome of a war depends on something much more mundane. Stockpiles, missiles, factories, and the simple question of who runs out first. Right now, the war between these three players is increasingly becoming a race, not just to destroy the targets, but to exhaust the other side's ability to keep fighting. We're only 5 days in, and there's already discussion about the longevity of it. A race that is predominantly between Iranian missile launchers and American interceptor missiles. As the side that wins that race could largely determine how this conflict lasts, how dangerous it becomes, but also, of course, the overall balance of power and dynamics of the whole region afterwards. So this may well sound abstract, but history shows us this kind of logistical race often decides wars completely. Look at the first Gulf War of 1991, where Iraq fired dozens of Scud missiles at Saudi Arabia and Israel. The US rushed Patriot interceptors into the region, turning that conflict into one of the first modern missile defense wars, but also one of the quickest and most overwhelming shows of collective force. More recently in Ukraine, Russia has launched these thousands of drones, thousands of missiles at Ukraine cities, forcing Kiev to rely on these limited stocks of Western air defense interceptors. In both cases, though, the question was the same. Who runs out first? So in this video, I wanted to explain three things. Firstly, how quickly both sides really are burning through weapons in this conflict, much more than you might have thought. Second, why the real bottleneck may not be the missiles, but the systems designed to shoot them down. And thirdly, why this war may ultimately be decided not by strategy or politics, but by logistics. Because modern warfare, especially high technology warfare, is increasingly the contest of industrial capacity, political will, and, of course, AI. This is the Global Gambit. How's it going, everyone? Welcome back to the channel where we look at the relationship between international relations, economics, and geopolitics, with particular emphasis on the war in Ukraine, or right now with updates on the situation in the Middle East between Iran, the United States, and Israel. Before getting into it, I wonder though, how much do you think that the materialistic elements, the missile, the ability to continue supply as we see Russia's war economy, continuing that but struggling in other areas, is critical to who comes out on top in the war between Iran, the US, and Israel? Let me know in the comments. So right now, the tempo of operations in this war have been extremely high from, as we know, the beginning. We're only in day 5. But according to estimates from Israeli analysts, the US and Israel have already carried out more than 2,000 strikes on targets throughout Iran. Now, each strike typically involves multiple precision weapons, cruise missiles, guided bombs, or standoff munitions, as they're known, launched from either aircrafts or ships. Iran, meanwhile, has responded with hundreds of ballistic missiles and more than 1,000 drones. Many of these projectiles, crucially though, have been intercepted. But of course, interception isn't free. Every missile that is shot down requires another missile, known as an interceptor, to destroy it. And those interceptors are expensive. They're complex and produced in relatively limited quantities, which means that every defensive success also consumes your resources. Now, before the war began, Iran was believed to possess one of the largest missile arsenals in the Middle East, in the world. Estimates suggested around 2,000 medium-range ballistic missiles capable of striking Israel. Additionally, Iran maintained several thousand short-range missiles that could target American bases in the Gulf states across the region, and is what we're primarily seeing it do right now. But missiles alone are not the key variable. The true constraint is actually the launchers. You see, ballistic missiles require specialized launch vehicles, command systems, and logistical support. So destroy the launchers and the missiles become much harder to use. That is why the US and Israeli forces have concentrated heavily since taking out Khamenei on Sunday on destroying Iran's launch infrastructure. Airstrikes have targeted missile bases, storage depots, transport vehicles, and, of course, the ever-important production facilities themselves. And at least based on Western claims, early indications suggest that this campaign is having an impact. Some reports suggest Iran missile launches have already fallen dramatically compared with the opening 4 or 5 days of the war. Other analysts believe Iran may be conserving its remaining stockpiles, undertaking a different overall strategy. But it may also be losing the ability to launch them, which is even more important regardless of what strategy it tries to use when striking. Then you have to consider the drones. Iran relies heavily on drones, particularly the Shahed-style one-way attack drones that are infamous in the war in Ukraine. These drones are cheaper and easier to produce than ballistic missiles. Estimates of around 15 to 20,000 production per drone, compared to 1 million for the United States in some cases. And that's the lower end. Ballistic missiles cost millions of dollars. The Shahed drone is just so much easier to utilize. That cost difference allows them to be produced, launched, and just leveraged in large quantities. Iran has reportedly produced tens of thousands of these systems and exported the technology abroad. Russia now has reverse engineered and manufactures its own versions for use, and they've also gained a lot of interest in southern parts of Asia and Africa. But even drones require logistics, supply chains, and the production facilities. And those factories are now targets. So with the US and Israeli aircraft operating with basically not just air superiority, but air supremacy, those facilities are absolutely vulnerable. Now, to understand why this logistic race matters, we need to look at the other side of the equation. America's advantage, but also its limits. The US remains the most powerful military in the world undisputably. Its conventional stockpiles are deeper than those of any other country. It has the economy behind it to pay for it as well. But that does not mean they're unlimited. Modern precision weapons are expensive and produced in surprisingly small numbers. Take the Patriots, one of the most widely used air defense systems in the world. Each interceptor missile costs roughly $4 million. So 20,000 for a Shahed drone to 4 million. And the United States currently produces only a few hundred per year. Now that sounds like a lot, but in the high tempo conflict that we're seeing, especially with the duration that the Trump administration claims it will continue at, well, they will disappear immediately. Especially when defenders typically fire 2 or 3 interceptors as a single ballistic missile to ensure the complete destruction. So that means one Iranian missile can consume $8 million worth of defensive missiles. Then there's the hidden vulnerability, or where the real strategic dilemma emerges. The US has continued striking targets in Iran for a long time. Once air defenses are suppressed and aircraft can operate more freely, those strikes do become cheaper. Instead of using long-range cruise missiles, aircraft can drop guided bombs such as JDAMs, which exist in far larger numbers. You can say that they're a bit more of a dumb bomb. Now, they have tens of thousands of these in the US, but air defense is different. Every time Iran launches a missile or drone, defenders must decide whether to intercept it. And every interceptor used is, of course, one less available for future conflicts. So that matters because the US is already stretched across multiple theaters. And air defense systems are needed in Europe to support Ukraine. They are needed in Asia to deter China, to deter North Korea over Japan or South Korea. And they're, of course, needed across much more of the Middle East to protect American bases, allies, and, well, in parts, Israel itself. So all of this means the war is increasingly becoming a battle of attrition already in the skies. Iran is trying to keeping to launching enough missiles and drones to force the US and its allies to keep firing interceptors. The US and Israel, meanwhile, are trying to race to destroy Iran's launch infrastructure before those defensive stockpiles begin to run low, i.e. both sides are trying to exhaust the other's ability to sustain the fight. And that is the essence of modern industrial warfare. And we have seen this dynamic before. During the later stages of the Cold War, NATO planners worried that Soviet missile barrages could overwhelm Western air defenses. Today, that same concern is appearing again, but in the case of drones, the defining feature of modern warfare, and the more conventional ballistic missiles, instead of Cold War bombers. Another factor that complicates this equation: weapons production cannot be increased overnight. Factories require years to expand capacity. Supply chains must be rebuilt, Specialized components must be manufactured and assembled. Even the US, with the defense budget approaching $1 trillion, largely surpassed it under Trump, this problem, well, it appears there and also elsewhere. American weapons supplies have been stretched for years because of Ukraine, and officials have previously acknowledged that sending large quantities of interceptors abroad can reduce domestic stockpiles. So this creates a strategic dilemma, a strategic trade-off for Washington. Every interceptor fired in the Middle East is one less available for other potential crises. If tensions rise in the Pacific for whatever reason, those systems will be suddenly needed there. Military planners therefore face this difficult balancing act, and they must protect troops and allies in the region while preserving enough capacity for future conflicts. So with all this in mind, and as the war continues to rage in frequency, what happens next? Likely outcome is that will heavily depend on which side's logistics collapse first. If the US and Israel succeed in destroying Iran's launches and production facilities, that missile threat will decline. That would reduce the pressure on air defense systems and allow the campaign to stabilize much longer. But if Iran can continue launching missiles and drones at this steady rate, the defense burden on the US and its allies, let alone the psychological impact and the reputational risk for Trump, is huge. So the strategic trade-off is much more difficult to ascertain. Wars are defined by many different features, but just as often they are decided by something quieter, the boring bits, the bits behind the front lines, the logistics, the stockpiles, and the production capacity. And right now, the war with Iran is increasingly becoming a race between offensive missiles and these defensive interceptors, a race between the factories and the launchers. And of course, as always, a race against time, because whichever side runs out of options first will determine how this conflict ends. But that's it from me. If you enjoyed the video, do give it a like and subscribe. Consider checking out the links in the description to support me further, and watch this video next to understand what China thinks about the war in Iran.